Well, good morning, Dr. Michael Fisher here. You can see a little bit of costume here, the white coat, the doctor, the therapist, the artist. I use it mostly for this, obviously, for painting, and I've used it for both. At times with children, I'll wear it. Um, it's this interesting overlap between the clinical and the aesthetic, the playful and dramatic performance aspect of the artist, and also the performative aspect of being the doctor, and the white coat becoming to symbolize, certainly way back, but not just medically, but particularly in the Freudian era of the beginning of psychiatry as we know it today. So this is a video too on another exploration of my walking in and through the psychiatric, as I called it, as a field in the last video. And you might want to watch that one before you watch this one just to get a little orientation, but it's not necessary. You'll probably be able to follow what's going on here too. I'm going to talk about Carl Jung again and reading from his book, Memory, Dreams, and Reflections, and some interesting stories he tells about his clients. He's telling those stories at the age of 81, as he's pretty much on the way out of living in this world. So I find that book really important. It's the autobiographic, as I said, of Jung, and his therapeutic work and practice, his reflections, and the deep chance for anyone reading it to really realize you got 50 years of experience of someone working in the deep psychotherapeutic aspects of the human psyche and soul and what they have to summarize. And so that's a really nice picking place. And so I have a really good case study I want to read today. And we'll discuss it a little bit here, but mostly I just want to present it because it's going to overlap with this theme of the clinical and the aesthetic. Just as I said, this quote today symbolizing those two aspects of a really important part of reality in my understanding, both as an artist and therapist and expressive kind of arts therapeutic worker, that these domains are very deep and very moving. They're very potent in the irrational world. And this is not just the irrational and rational world, but the irrational world that kind of is transversal to those opposites of the rational, irrational. More complicated theorizing, I don't want to get into that here, but follow with me through a little bit of a story first, and that will kind of warm you up too to this next rendition of my exploring the psychiatric. Okay, so just for, I'm not a psychiatrist, okay, not certified, etc., etc. So I said that in video one to make sure if you didn't see that video. Okay, we're on the same page now. I'm a human being exploring the healing process and the hurting processes and what happens to, in the most severe cases, when we enter into this really near psychotic or heavily neurotic zones of operations. And also when those become normalized to the point where we cannot even recognize them, and points where they're actually rewarded in the society. Small fact, a lot of people have been studying the narcissistic personality disorder, the antisocial personality disorders, and more of those studies. I have not studied in detail those studies, but they are coming out as psychiatrists, and as people who have studied psychiatry in a journalistic way to show that a lot of research are showing that many of our leaders in the Western contemporary capitalist kind of world that we live in, many of our leaders, they float up to the top in the most powerful positions because they have those actual psychiatric problems, challenges, and yes, in many cases, they are disorders, untreated, perhaps, or they're being treated and not adequately, possibly, and or they're just being not recognized. And these people are the most successful people in our world. and in the places where they have immense power to push buttons and funnel dollars and so on into affecting the entire world. It is a strange place where leadership has gone. It's the worst of leadership. We also have, the creme de la creme of the best, which I also study, but more and more people are studying the pathologies of leadership. I have not done that so much. Maybe I will someday. Maybe the series I'm doing on psychiatric right now is a lead up to my investigating why leadership moves that way, and these certain pathologies are accepted and rewarded for operating in them, right, to get to the top. Okay, I got a cold, so I'm going to scratch my nose a bit, sniffle a bit. Hope that doesn't bother you too much. It was a severe cold for about 5 days, and I'm just barely recovering. But I wanted to get on to this exciting memory for me. It's my first when we started the In Search of Fearlessness Center in Calgary. So I'm founder of that movement and that center with some other people, but I was kind of the initial founding visionary of it and directed the center. So we actually opened a center. It was in a small strip mall, like 300 square feet. It was just minimal budget. We just were believing, this is my partner, Barbara at the time, and myself, but I was definitely there the most all the time, virtually answering the door, leaving the door open for people to walk in. And so on the sign, we finally got on the big window in the front of the strip mall, said the Center in Search of Fearlessness Center. There was a drop-in center. It was a place for healing and personal development and growth, but very hard to describe by those languages what we were actually doing and what was in my vision for this really a fearlessness movement that I was working on in a liberational model of adult education for people. But that's hard to market, so you kind of call it personal growth and development because people relate to it. So yes, I had therapeutic capacities and capabilities for sure, and some people utilize that. But there's also just people dropping in and wanting attention. It's just like a good minister. They may not be trained as a therapist, but they learn how to listen and they know the value of that for people. So I had those capacities as well. And then I had the artistic, and part of our room, when you walked into our little center, little institute in a way, there was a lot of art supplies on the walls, hanging, and tables and places at the back where people could just come in and make creation making. We just encourage them, or they can come and just make tea and coffee and do whatever they wanted. Well, we had no idea who would walk in the door. Can you imagine? You put up a sign, In Search of Fearlessness Center, Research Institute. Then the other one was the School of Sacred Warriorship. So that's where I'm going to talk about today. School of Sacred Warriorship was one of the domains or branches of In Search of Fearlessness project. I saw a really important role for people to learn to both identify, adapt to, reintegrate, heal through the deepest wounds of the rebel, and the rebel that wants to become the great sacred warrior. And so I'm going to explain that in this video because it's not the focus. So just to give you that sense. So I did have a school, and I eventually attracted several students. I'll talk about that and why that's where I met some of my first, most potent, intense experiences as I was facilitating a group for about 2 years of people wanting to take this program to become sacred warriors in the world. That attracted very interesting people and a lot of problems that I had to deal with that I wasn't totally aware of, but I was prepared to do it. So that's a 2-year venture. Met some people. I'll explain that in a minute. But the first day I think, or 2, we were open with our new signs up, and somebody walked in the door. I watched them push in the front door because I had a curtain on the front too, so people couldn't always see, and I couldn't see who was always walking on the street. Wanted a little privacy. And the door opens slightly because it was open door and pushed open, then it closed shut. And of course, I'm sitting there. Usually, I'm reading or doing research. If no people are around or no clients are coming for a session or anything like that. And so Then a few minutes later, the walk open door opens, in person pokes in their head, and I say, "Hello." This is fellow, kind of mid-30s, kind of a dark, almost sort of a little bit creepy looking look on the face and so on, and very disheveled. Middle of summer, wearing a total down filled, quilted, very dirty jacket coat, like for winter, like in the Arctic. And I'm going, okay, it's like 80 above outside. Anyway, that began my relationship with a fellow. I'll just call him Jay for the moment. And Jay was really interesting, and really deep friendship in many ways. I say deep, but definitely a skewed deep. It's not a normal, intimate, relational deep that you would have with someone who is operating in a more, quote, within the normal frames of what we call conventional relating and awareness of reality. This person was not. And they came in at one point and just said hello. I don't know how many times they walked by and stuck their head in. Many times. This person, obviously, Jay, was walking the streets, walking in the community, just roaming. I didn't have no clue who they were. I had seen them once in a while walking with that particular coat again on virtually any kind of day. And it definitely struck me as somebody who's probably an outpatient of a mental hospital. That said, although I didn't know, this person lived only a block or two away from the center. And so they were part of the community and had owned a house there, did own a house with a wife and had a child and larger background. But this individual was my first really deep encounter of being in a space called the fearlessness space, right? The space of sacred warriorship. And how would this individual, psychiatric individual, and they were diagnosed with schizophrenia years ago after very severe incidents, traumatic incidents that he later related to me. And Jay eventually began talking, sit down, make some tea, and very nervous about me and what we were about, but he was curious. And man, more curious than people in the community. Like I thought like the guy's pretty courageous. And he was. But in a particular perspective, courageous. He wasn't courageous enough and capable enough to be back in the working world and functioning. He needed a lot of services and was going to AA and all these problems. He had other problems too, addictions. So Jay did come in, and we found companionship right on the couch. Or then he'd sometimes get up some piece of paper. He'd go back to the art table and start drawing stuff, and I'd just be quiet. I'd just keep doing my work. So I never put any pressure on him. But I was always there to interact. And then he started telling me the stories of. First, he starts by introducing his connection with me through mathematics and his really obviously brilliant mind, obviously a very gifted thinker. That is not uncommon with people who get diagnosed with schizophrenia early in life. And it's definitely a relationship of a brain and mind that just goes way beyond where most people can actually operate in the society and connect with. And so often quite visionary as well with those very bright intellects. Well, way beyond mine. I mean, his intellect's way beyond mine. And as I learned out later, he actually had a degree in engineering and then was trying to get a degree in ecological design. Never could complete it because of the schizophrenia. It just took over his life and destroyed his career, his engineering career in the oil patch and so on. But eventually he had a psychotic break. And I talked about that in the last video. I found this out from him. So he's introducing me this mathematical stories and formula. And he's got inventions about numbers. And I don't understand the method. And then he eventually, through that, starts to talk about, his vision for inventing a new kind of lichen combination that would be able to save the tundra and after the oil field companies go in and wreck the tundra and drilling in the unfrozen tundra during the summertime and the muskeg and so on. Very a lot of environmental damage. So he had a very sensitive ethic as well, which often schizophrenic people's diagnosed all do have more or less. This has been my experience over and over. They're very sensitive and they have great empathy as well. Now, they may not act that out with you when you meet them, or they are operating around you in their more or less near psychotic and or just neurotic states, dissociated states. You may not feel that sensitivity and empathy that they have, mainly because it's channeled into very particular coding and fantasies, actually, and or sometimes visions, and they are just living in somewhere else. Like, right, they're just not on this plane. You could say it's a more liminal reality between the one we know concretely. Uh, it's something other in between, you know. And so yeah, he was definitely there in between. And so you're relating. I was learning to relate to someone in between and going through. I'd never had the chance to really be with a schizophrenic diagnosed person, quite active. Obviously, he was on drugs of some kind at times, often didn't take his meds, as he told me, or his wife told me, who I met later. And that is for lots of reasons. He found when he took the meds, as this is typical, it cuts off so much of the creativity of his mind. He just goes quite dead. And so he's more compatible, right, with the world, perhaps with raising his daughter and being responsible to make sure, you know, he took the garbage out. Um, but it was problems. It was problematic for him. That's not his choice. He much more enjoyed himself in his world, in mind, thought, in this fantasizing and or just really interesting thinking and theorizing that he was doing. Um, he doesn't want to be on those kinds of suppressive drugs that deaden the mind and deaden his aliveness, his spirit, his impulses to create. So that aside, we could go on and on with talking about Jay, but I wanted to share that with you, that he was my very early experience when I opened up the center in Calgary. And that was, he stayed in that community for virtually 9 years, the whole full time, more or less. And then I had him in a small group, which was really hard to get him there. It took many years for him to trust. And he was also getting a little bit better, his symptomatologies. And maybe it was some of the work we were doing in our community, but probably just maybe it was a cycle he was going through. He was doing his own recovery work to the best of his ability. I would say no, he never ever recovered to become what I'd call a normal working adult. No, he did have those. His wife eventually separated from him. He may have even lost his house and went and lived alone somewhere. So don't know where his destiny is to this day, but really enjoyed that relationship. But he came in a small group in the School of Sacred Warriorship, and that came with a bunch of other people that were in that group. So that was amazing to get him to do group work. For me anyway. It took years, like 3 or 4 years, before he was capable to do that. So the interesting story of when you bring people together with those kinds of struggles, remember that I'm not doing this in a clinical institute. I'm not the regular clinical doctor. At that time, I didn't even have a master's degree or a PhD. I was basically a B.Ed student, a BSc in science. I was doing this because I just knew how to work with this kind of problems of the mind and the soul. And I had had a lot of experience and still was working at a treatment center for youth. And that was under a clinical model and supervision and funded by the government of Alberta, etc. So I was learning just tons, and this is like the real practitioner base, although I'm reading tons as well. But I'm very much was learning just from the practice of how to work with youth and families, and you know, a lot of disturbed behavior, pathologies of kinds. All right, so this one group, I'll just tell that quick story of I've got 3 or 4 people in the group of Sacred Warriorship who are definitely in the mental health category of they ought to have a diagnosis, do have a diagnosis, aren't taking their meds, whatever it was, combinations thereof. Um, Definitely a couple with what I probably diagnosed or could be diagnosed as by a psychiatrist as borderline personality disorders. I used to put a lot of those diagnoses into, I just called it people that have basically, had a disattachment trauma, a very deep set of disattachment traumas, and obviously, no doubt, abandonment abuses that go with those. So they were people unable, they were living in this borderline space, you could call it, of not quite here connected, not quite totally unconnected, insane. They're somewhere in the middle. And so they are trying to relate to people. They want to be around people, but they are just unable, I found, to attach and be responsible and even have the basic social skills to connect and stay in social cueing that would keep them, to be able to have a good relationship more or less with somebody. Um, no, there's so much disconnect and so much in their own world and their own ways of interpreting things and then missing cues. And it drives people nuts if you're around people like that, who are unattached, basically, and floating. They don't have roots. And I met a lot of those same kind of boys in the adolescent program treatment center I mentioned at Quest Ranch, where I worked as a therapist, that they also had this free floating quality. They couldn't quite attach. And so they're trying to attach and then they're not able. So it's kind of grab you and they want to suck you in. They want to get your attention. And then when you get close, then they push you away. Okay, well, a lot of people have that, a little bit of that patterning, fear-based, of, attachment, want to get close, don't, and then push you away, disappear. But the unattached, deeply patterned in the personality structure and often from deep trauma, as far as I know. But there could be other organic features to disattachment. Not an expert in that field. They just are really difficult people to be around. You have to be incredibly patient. You have to be able to be playful and try to be creative with them and learn different ways. So this was the art that I learned. I was just so great training ground for me to be with people like that. But when you got 3 or 4 of those in a group, and then you got some fairly quite normal functional people trying to do the sacred warriorship training, it was a tough combination. But the bottom line story is I used to use a feather, when we were trying to share in a circle, we're just starting, and this is early in the morning. We'd have like a 3 or 4 hour intensive um, connection 3 times a week. I think we'd start at like 4:30 in the morning. I was really pushing the sacred warriors really to come out and be self-disciplined. But again, they came, and these are people, again, you'd call more or less psychiatric disordered folks. Yeah, different, neurodiversities and so on, but they are really troublesome individuals to be around, and the world doesn't handle them well. They don't handle the world well. Like it or not, you can label that any way you want. Quote, they're not functional in this world. So they would come in the morning. So they were quite disciplined, those folks as well. So thank you to them. I used to love them because they were disciplined in that way. So I had a non-judgmental view toward them, even though I'm still making distinctions about their differences and differences that make a difference, not just differences because it's politically correct to acknowledge they are different. The differences that they made were quite destructive to the self and to others in the community. Possibility, because we had a community, I saw the impact they had on the community and how the community was affected by these individuals. Very powerful. Myself as well, of course, to some degree, but I had a lot more capacity than most community members, and same in this group in the sacred warriorship. And so I gave them the feather and I says, pass that around. And when you've got the feather, that means you can speak and say whatever you need to say. Everybody listens. When you pass the feather, then the person gets another turn. So no interruptions, right? Well, they thought everything was just good. They liked this process and they had this big, long eagle feather. And, part of that is to control violent outbursts in group processes where people just react to somebody and then they react back. And yeah, you could have people hitting and fighting and screaming at each other very quickly. It was volatile, and I give a lot of leg room for that. I give a lot of leeway room for those kinds of volatilities. I sometimes think they're great learning sites, and of course, it's a very fine line how far you let that go or not go. You have to let people learn to defend themselves and set up their boundaries and learn how to come back. So it's conflict management, and it's also kind of like a martial art. It's not about let's all be peaceful and silent and meditative and mindful. You're not going to get deep therapeutic work done in those modalities of treatment and processes. So that's not what I do. That's not what I did. I'm differently interested in these workings of the deeper underground and the unconscious, and let's learn from them and learn how to give them capacity. I say them, those energies, forces, libidos, call it what you will, the unconscious, rather than trying to control it through mindfulness and other kinds of relaxation techniques. So pass the feather around. Well, several days, but it was hilarious the first time it happened. Hilarious, tragic at another level. Um, when they're sharing something and somebody reacts, I say, "Oh, they've got the feather." Just always remind you of the rules. Okay, okay. And they can't react, so they wait till their turn, right? And after a while, a couple people were grabbing the feather. Their turn. That's fine. It's all legit. And then they take it to basically yell and scream at the other person. And a couple times they actually went up to the person because they've been listening to something they were saying and they just totally got triggered by it. And they would walk up and hit the person with the feather. And I said, "Well, go ahead, hit him with the feather." So, there could have been pillows, right? But it's like there we were, there was this sacred feather, about listening, and at least there wasn't knives or swords or guns being brought out. Then they used the feather to whack each other at times. It never sort of got out of control, but they got really angry and let it fly too. So just to let you know, the sacred feather in a real authentic therapeutic circle can be used for multiple modes. So that was my experience with a couple of individuals in that community, and again because they were long term. And the other one in that community that really, and I won't make a big story of it, but they were a hoarder, and this person definitely had some pretty strong psychiatric issues untreated, but had found many very interesting, and it was really on a long journey of trying to figure out from alcoholism recovery, um, kind of an ex-nurse and lost her career, became very isolated, lived with 10 or 12 cats in the house, and the house was completely packed solid, um, in her hoarding, as was her car. And yet this person was constantly going out in the streets, buying more stuff at secondhand stores or garage sales, and then trading and probably making some money to keep living, and was on disability insurance and so on. But they kept coming to community events, and I knew they were going to many of the new age and healing different things, and tried many things. They knew everybody in town. And so it was a very interesting individual. And one time I went to work with her. Um, she was just unsatisfied with many of the therapists and people, healers, and spiritual communities. And so she said, "I really want to work on my anger." She said, "Oh, well, I'll do it with you, anger if you want." So they came to the center one day, booked a session, and came in, and I was watching them. I was pretty nervous because this person I didn't know all that well at the time, and a very big woman, outweighed me by three times plus, and was, just really angry. You could see it in her face, just like, So I'm like a fairly little guy, and I was like, okay, she's a little scary to me for sure, but okay, I'm gonna do this. work on anger. So I watch her coming out of her car, and she's pulling out her big red bag, huge duffel bag, packed full of soft rags and stuff. And she's got a baseball bat, and she's bringing that in with her out of the car. I'm sitting in my little, 300 square foot little office going, okay, geez, I wonder what the neighbors are going to think on either side of us in the strip mall. There's two different retail stores. So all that became quite a little drama, right? So you can imagine, see the drama building around the pathology of the attention it wants to offer, the defense it wants to offer. And I have to read it two ways, not just read what a threat it is to me or others or themselves. I'm reading the symptomatology of that presentation. Right? They're presenting themselves through these every behavior, every way they dress, every way they sound, every way they drive their car, what they put in their car. Everything is a presentation of their condition, the human condition for them at this time, and obviously related to what the past has accumulated toward. And so there they come into the center. I'm in the middle of prepping myself, and I see this big presentation come in the door, right? The big thing, the banging of the bat on the door, and it just, okay, I'm ready to go. And so I read it as this is a huge crying, right? It's a huge calling coming. So that what makes me a good person to work with the psychiatric domain of experiencing. I read these as interesting cues. And so that's the artist in me, as well as the clinician observer, naturalist, observer of human behavior, animal behavior, life, existence, that everything is presenting and representing, and not always in a straightforward code, right? You just can't read it up straight up front. So this is where Carl Jung talks about you have to read underneath and read at the deeper level. And he says in curiosity, that's the story I'll read to you, the case study in a moment, follow curiosity, and even getting what he calls to the beauty of the symptomatology, the beauty of the pathology itself. Oh yeah, I really make that, it's an intuitive thing for me to do. I have a gift for it, but no one trained me how to do that. I just had it. And I think it's because of my background in different ways, which I will not try to explain here. That would take too long. So their first session was, okay, let's work with your anger. So it says for now, we just leave the bat there and throw it off the bag. We may use it in the session, but let's just start here. And so I'm like totally going intuitively here without getting a lot of, I'm not doing the typical, give me your background bio and fill out this form. And so, no. I just working with what I see, what's showing up, who's in front of me, and I've got good attention. So picking up all kinds of signals that I don't even know I'm going to be getting from the unconscious reading with this person. And they had really good eye contact, which was interesting. So this is somebody who's obviously worked with a lot of people. So I was surprised how much capability they had for good eye contact. So that helps. I can read a lot more that way. And I did. And I said, well, let's start here. I'm going to give you some warning here. I'm going to give you a strong signal. It's going to be a verbal signal. And I'm going to just offer it intuitively the way I think it ought to be offered. And then I'm just going to have you just respond to whatever it is, right? So I'm going to only offer it once. It's going to be a very quick signal, and then you just respond. And I'll be here to be there for you in your response. So notice how I'm setting this person up, that I will catch you if you fall. And I didn't say that, but that's what I said, because here she's standing up, right? It's huge woman. She's out really, you can just feel the anger holding the character armor. Everything's there, protection. And not really want to connecting with me as fully a human being. I could feel I'm not a human being for this person, totally. I'm an object. And I'm an object where her psyche, soul is trying to work through and needs objects to do that with. Every psyche does to some degree. love objects, feared objects, enemy objects, whatever it is that this is the drama. So I'm willing to be that for this therapeutic session. Then in the moment, I basically just burst out when she was ready. I burst out with no, and just upscale that by about 20 decibels and intensities. The look is still one of reception, it's not one of hate, but it was just a potent, powerful no that went through, and that was received by her, and she immediately broke down, tears crying, and she virtually collapsed at her knees. I grabbed her body and put her on the couch. And that was really almost hypnotic, you would say, or it because I was just right on the mark. Intuitively, I knew exactly how to give the opposite of what this person was expecting. And it was also something they obviously were hurt by in getting this intense no early in their life. But I didn't give it to them in a destructive way. See, I gave it to them, telling them I will be there to receive you after I deliver. And that's not typically what happens when you get said no to by a very strong authoritative figure, or many of them in your life, where you actually feel completely rejected, ashamed, and assaulted. So also later, as we talked with her and she cried for quite a while, we did a review of why would that have happened, that you broke down so quickly on just the word no. I didn't ask for anything from you, didn't demand anything. I just put the stimuli in front of you. And she basically said, I've never been able to say no like that to another person who is hurting me. And so what she had learned is all kinds of strategies of how to say no without saying no. And that's where you basically move away from a person. You don't listen to them, you dissociate from them, you forget them. There's all ways of saying no. I'm not ready. I don't want to work with you. I don't like you, whatever it might be. But a lot of times that would have been too threatening to the young child, particularly. Or adolescents and so on, when you don't have a lot of authority. And sometimes, yeah, if you're an employee, you can't say no to your boss, and on, right? Or to the doctor. She was a nurse for years, so you can just imagine the kind of oppression she worked with underneath the biomedical model of establishment of authority. Okay, so there's a few examples now. I'll read Jung, give you a flavor of this case. It's about a page and a half. I don't know if I'm going to discuss much after it, but it's just to add to psychiatric number 2 video. And here we go. Enjoy. So Jung says, regarding them from the outside, talking about these severe mental patients that he had, all we see of the mentally ill is their tragic destruction, rarely the life of that side of the psyche which is turned away from us. Outward appearances are frequently deceptive, as I discovered to my astonishment in the case of a young catatonic patient. I'm fascinated by catatonic patients, by the way. There's several stories in here and other places. I think I'm really going to do a study of the catatonic and its movements in and out and how you work with that. It's for simple sake, it's the frozen condition where people actually freeze, or they'll stop walking and stop talking. She was 18 years old, and she came from a cultivated family. At the age of 15, she had been seduced by her brother and abused by a schoolmate. From her 16th year on, she retreated into isolation. She concealed herself from people, and ultimately, the only emotional relationship left to her was one of a vicious watchdog which belonged to another family, in which she tried to win over. She grew steadily odder, and at the age of 17 was taken to the mental hospital, where she spent a year and a half. She heard voices, refused food, and was completely mutistic, that is, no longer spoke. When I first saw her, she was in typical catatonic state. In the course of many weeks, I succeeded very gradually in persuading her to speak. persuading her to speak. After overcoming many resistances, she told me she had lived on the moon. The moon, it seemed, was inhabited, but at first she had seen only men. They had at once taken her with them and deposited her in a sublunar dwelling where their children and wives were kept below ground. For on the high mountains of the moon there lived a vampire who kidnapped and killed the women and children, so that the moon people were threatened with extinction. That was the reason for the sublunar existence of the feminine half of the population. Interesting, right? Within a patriarchal dominated culture, being played out even in her moon story scape here, this mythology. The feminine is still repressed. My patient made up her mind to do something for the moon people one day and planned to destroy the vampire. After long preparation, she waited for the vampire on the platform of a tower which he had erected for this purpose. After a number of nights, she at last saw the monster approaching from afar, winging his way toward her like a great black bird. She took her long sacrificial knife, concealed it in her gown, and waited for the vampire's arrival. Suddenly he stood before her. He had several pairs of wings. His face and entire figure was covered by them, and so that she could see nothing but his feathers. Wonderstruck, she was seized by curiosity to find out what he really looked like. She approached, and on the knife, suddenly the wings opened, and a man of unearthly beauty stood before her. He enclosed her in his winged arms with an iron grip, so that she could no longer wield the knife. In any case, lost my train of thought there. I was thinking of something else. In any case, she was so spellbound by the vampire's look that she would not have been capable of striking. He raised her from the platform and flew off with her. After this revelation, she was once again able to speak without inhibition. So her voice came back after she shared him, Jung, right now able to talk in and through this fantasy life. Jung called it kind of a mythological world that she lived in. Very important for her to cope with deep psychic trauma. So she was able to speak without inhibition now, but yet her resistances still emerged. In other words, new resistances. It seemed that I had stopped her return to the moon. Yeah, that's what can happen. When you come in as a psychiatric intervention, a therapist, or whatever other way, you can actually destroy defenses of the psychic trauma. And that becomes and can easily become another traumatizing and very terrifying and even destructive process if you don't catch it. And that's why commitment to being a therapist, psychiatrist for someone going through very deep work like this, you have to be there to work with the next set of defenses. You can't just leave people with some defenses knocked off and then new ones are coming in. And there's a plethora of defenses, let me tell you. There's a huge creativity for them. She could no longer escape from the earth, right, in her moon world now. This world was not beautiful, she said, but the moon was beautiful, and life there was rich in meaning. Sometime later, she suffered a relapse, however, into her catatonia again, and I've had to have her taken to the sanatorium. It was so intense, even he couldn't work with her anymore. So in a way, you see, the defenses shut him down. He, in a way, would be an enemy at that point for her psychotic processing and the need for all those defensive systems. He was cracking into them, but they flip that, and that's what I call the elastic band effect. Someone can make great products insight, and whoa, then it sucks them right back, and then they can't relate to you, don't want to relate to you, they hate you, and one minute they thought you were the best person in their life, and now you're the enemy. For a while, she was violently insane. So this time she got more and more violent and could not be trusted. She had to be completely incarcerated. When she was discharged after 2 months of that sanatorium experience, it was once again possible to talk with her. Gradually, she came to see that life on Earth was unavoidable. Desperately, she fought against this conclusion and its consequences and had to be sent back to the sanatorium again. Sad but true. Once I visited her in her cell and said to her, "You know, all this won't do any good. You cannot return to the moon." She took this with silence and with an appearance of utter apathy. This time she was released after a short stay and resigned herself to her fate. For a while, she took a job as a nurse in a sanatorium. There was an assistant doctor there who made somewhat rash approach to her one day. She responded with a revolver shot. Luckily, the man was only slightly wounded. We're talking the early 1900s here. But the incident revealed that she went about with a revolver all the time. She was a carrying revolver gun person. Once before, she had turned up with a loaded gun. During the last interview, this is with him, during the last interview, at the end of the treatment, so she's obviously making a lot of progress, she gave the gun to me. When I asked in amazement what she was doing with it, she replied, "I would have shot you down if you had failed me." End quote. I mean, it's a laughable, absurd moment story. I love it. When the excitement over the shooting has subsided, she returned to her native town. So she married, had several children, and survived 2 world wars in the East without ever again suffering a relapse. He knew her for a very long time. That's a longitudinal connection he had. And he's basically just showing she actually became, quote, a normal person. So after all of that story and all of the movements in and out of catatonia and severe insanity, it was still a very successful case. So I share that with you today. A little bit of magic there, a little bit of, you can see the importance of beauty and the search for beauty when the psyche feels there's so much destruction going on and doesn't see answers of the way out. It's almost like beauty is not an answer, but it's like a place. It's like a vehicle for travel, at least so that you don't have to stay in total paralyzation. And that's what fantasy, from the best I can understand it in the psychiatric term, in the way it's conducted in the unconscious, in the relationship with the subconscious and conscious. Fantasy is the art. It's the art performative. It's the performative of the psychic troubling, of the pathologizing that is necessary. See, in this sense, when conditions are of such enormous disabling conditions to a human being, to a psyche, to a soul in its repression of the soul, growth and development to freedom, etc., that sometimes the only route out, only route, it's not, and you can see it's not rational, it's not logical, but it's like evocative, it's aesthetic driven. That's why Jung points out, when you look at that story and you read it, it's like, whoa, the importance of aesthetics, the beautiful moon, right? The beautiful place to live, and etc. So these are a few insights for today. Thanks for listening today. I look forward to your comments, and I'll soon do a psychiatric 3 in a little bit of time. Okay, bye now.